Guys ready? You think I'm ready? Am I on? Oh, good. All right. So the scripture this morning for this mountaintop journey comes from a small section in the Gospel of Mark. This is at the end of Holy Week. So they've already come up into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and we're sort of toward the end of Holy Week, what we would know as Maundy Thursday. Just so that's where you are a little bit in the story. I'm skipping a lot. You'll get it next week in a very exciting way. So here's the reading this morning from the Gospel of Mark. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb was sacrificed, disciples said to Jesus, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover meal?" He sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city. A man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs already furnished. Prepare for us there." The disciples left, came into the city, found everything just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. That evening, Jesus arrived with the 12. During the meal, Jesus said, "I assure you that one of you will betray me, someone eating with me." Deeply saddened, they asked him one by one, "It's not me, is it?" Jesus answered, "It's one of the 12 who is dipping bread with me into this bowl. The human one goes to his death just as it was written about him. But how terrible it is for that person who betrays the human one. It would have been far better for him if he had never been born." While they were eating, Jesus took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." He took a cup, gave thanks, and gave it to them, and they all drank from it. He said to them, "This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. I assure you that I won't drink wine again until that day when I drink in the new way in God's kingdom." After singing songs of praise, they went out to the Mount of Olives. This is a reading from the scripture this morning. They came up to Jerusalem with all the fervor of selective memory to celebrate the Passover of God. They remembered the story of Pharaoh. They remembered the story of the 10 plagues and the death of the firstborn. They remembered the entrance into the promised land, dry shod, with the Ark of the Covenant going before them. They remembered Joshua calling the people and echoing with their voice says, "Today, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." They came up into Jerusalem, all the people, Jesus and the disciples included, voices united in the psalm of ascent, walking up Mount Zion, to the Temple Mount, to the dwelling place of God. They come with that selective memory, seeming to forget all the whining in the wilderness. "Are we there yet? He's touching me. I'm thirsty. I gotta pee." They seem to forget all about the golden calf or the reasons Joshua called them together. And definitely they forgot about the prophets of Baal and how they had drawn the people away from the worship of the true God. Selective memory brings them forward. It brings them right up into the city of Jerusalem. So we have gift number 1. Get your bearings. This has been our gift on our entire journey. We have to get our bearings. This Jerusalem that they're going up into is not the Jerusalem and temple of Solomon's days. That temple, beautiful as it was, had been destroyed long before by the Babylonians. The people were then taken into exile, and after a time returned to their home, where they, under the direction of Ezra and Nehemiah, built a second temple. Time passed between the building of that second temple and the story that we read this morning, and time has passed till the time that King Herod, you know that guy, the babies, who was the king, the slaughter of the innocents, that King Herod. He expanded the Temple Mount. Now, the temple that was rebuilt was up on a hill, on the second hill in the city of Jerusalem. And it is not an easy task to expand just about anything in the first century, right? And he's on a hill, and you think, just shove a bunch of dirt in there, and then you can level it out. Isn't that what you do when you make a sandcastle or something, right? Just shove the dirt out there and pack it in on the side. And well, there wasn't enough fill for that. There wasn't enough thing. So what he did was he had them build huge arches. I mean, huge arches, multi-story arches. And on top of all those arches, he put a new roof, or became the top of the Temple Mount. He expanded it and made it grander and more beautiful at great expense. And for what, one wonders? An act of hubris? Yeah, so you can see here it is here on where we are. The Temple Mount is up in the top. And he expanded that space to be what it is today, where Mike and Maggie and some others have walked, where it is large and vast. And I wonder, did he do it just, compensation, making sure everybody knew what a big man he was, how grand and powerful he was? Was it to allow for more worship? Or perhaps it was a larger space for money changers and the like? I don't know. And in this space, I just want you to note a couple of things. You can see, this is not topographical, that you get the little lines that show you things, and it's not all that clear. There's a valley here on the bottom, and the Kidron Valley that runs here. Thank you, Catherine. And that will separate the Mount Zion from the Mount of Olives. Okay? So you know where we're going, folks, don't you? All right. But our second gift is expect the unexpected and deal with it. When Jesus enters that city, when he goes up to Mount Zion, to Jerusalem, with all of those people, the unexpected happen. The people hail him as a king, even though he's riding humbly on a donkey. They carpet the road with palms and their cloaks and shout, "Hosanna, bless us, save us, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." These words echo off the walls, joining with the ancient words of Joshua's people saying, "As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord," joining the still small voice of God in those moments between the shouts. They shout, I think, with selective memory. They shout with lived experience of oppression, but forgetting to live one-footed. Now, some of you know what that means. They forget to do the one thing, right? Stand on one foot and recite all of the Torah. Can anybody do it? You can. You can. Well, maybe I can. Right? You love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else just tells you how to do that. They forgot how to live that way. They shouted all right, but I don't know that they remembered to live one-footed. Maybe that's what they needed to be saved from, two-footed living, with myself firmly planted in the world. Maybe that's what we need when we shout Hosanna in the days to come. The week of Holy Week will go by and much will happen, none of which will be discussed this morning. Those details I will leave for you to think about and wonder about and experience next week. But at the end of the week, the disciples wonder where they'll celebrate this year's Passover meal, a meal of remembrance, a meal that thinks in two directions. I want you to think about that. Thinks in two directions. It makes us remember God's saving grace in the Exodus story, but it also makes us think forward, that God will also be there to save us when we choose to say yes to God. Now, Jesus doesn't quite come out like my book did and say, expect the unexpected, but he tells the disciples to go into town and look for a man carrying water and follow him. And the master will provide a place for them to gather, to do their remembering, to do their hoping. So you think, no biggie, right? Go in, see the guy, find a room, we're all set. The biggie thing that often passes us by is that men in the first century did not carry water in jugs. If they carried water, which is possible, they would have carried it in leather bags. Now, I'm not sure why one was the other, but the job that this man was doing was not culturally normal. So Jesus is already telling us to look to the margin, look to the edge, look to where God's grace can be expansive. And that's where we'll go. I think when we imagine what it is to be on the edge and to be in that place of ever expanding grace and love, we can see this story in a whole way, a little bit different. Expect the unexpected. Now, I found a little bit of unexpected in my study this week. I was reading, and the Passover meal, we know it's like in the upper room, right? That's what we always know. It's always in the upper room. And what I read is this. In a crowded Jerusalem, the eating quarters of a family were often in the upper room above the din of the street or perhaps above a shop. The designation of large, mega, sounds familiar, right? Literally means great. So it's a great room. We know what those are, right? We have them in our house. And it suggests that more than 12, Jesus and the 12 were present. Would have been big enough for more. It was well furnished. The Greek is, I'm going to try and say this, astromenon. And it literally means spread out and carpeted. And it describes a festive room with covered couches for the guests to recline on. And guests reclining means you're not a slave, right? Which is another way to remember God's saving grace in that story. But it also echoes another word. Just literally in the hearing time of the Gospel of Mark, the people come up into Jerusalem, and what do the people do when they shout Hosanna? They lay out their coats and the palms on the ground, which is the estronasan, the same verb, to lay out. Lay out in preparation for Jesus to come in to Jerusalem, and this room is laid out. I wonder how that echoed. We don't hear it in the same, I don't think, the same profound way, but we know that when the cloaks are laid out and those people shout Hosanna, that the words will turn to crucify him. So are we surprised that when the conversation in the upper room where things have been laid out, it changes from the praise of God to betrayal? For the disciples, the pronouncement of the betrayal may have been unexpected. But for the early listeners of the Gospel of Mark, I don't think it was. So this leads us to our third gift. You can face your fear without going over the edge. The fact that the disciples each ask one by one, the text says, if Jesus thinks that they could be the one to betray him, is curious to me. You know, if your mother walks into the kitchen and said, who stole the cookie? Y'all know who did it, right? And you don't go like, was it me? Like, could I have done it? When you clearly didn't, it was that older brother or younger sister. They did it, right? So that the disciples asked Jesus if they could be the one to betray him is curious to me. So they must have had some thought in their head that this was a possibility. In their heart of hearts, were they frustrated with Jesus that he wasn't the kind of Messiah they wanted him to be, or needed him to be, or thought he would be? Was the conversation amongst the disciples that preceded their entrance into Jerusalem about, well, can I sit on your right hand? Can I sit on your left hand? Can I sit? Remember that conversation? They're coming in, and who's going to be the greatest? I want to be on your right or your left. Was that conversation unresolved? And so therefore echoed underneath the glory of the Passover story? Did they do some of that selective remembering and wanting to be God's people and always be faithful and forget the whining? I wonder how they, in that moment of silence, following Jesus' words, someone will betray me, face their own fear without going over the edge? How did they listen to the words of Jesus about woe to the one who would betray him? Did they fear grip their heart as they imagined what that betrayal would mean? Their own, possibly. I had never thought about the fact that they must have wondered about themselves and their capacity to betray Jesus, or they wouldn't have each asked, could it be me? And when they thought about that, could they have imagined crucifixion? I think they could have, because they had come that day from Bethany, and in order to get from Bethany to Jerusalem, you have to walk on the roads, and all those roads had more crucifixes than you want to imagine. It was a way of imperial Rome to make sure people stayed in their zone. Do not deviate, or this is where you'll end up. Not pretty, not nice, very intentional. So they knew about crucifixion. They knew about the power of Rome and the death. And I wonder what was going through their heads, what was going through their hearts when they asked if it could be me. Jesus must have known how their heads and hearts danced on the edge of fear. And in those moments, he did something very concrete and real and recentered them and remembered them. In that moment, could it be me? They are separate, right? It's all about me, my personal. And so he says, I want you to be remembered, reconnected. So Jesus said, remember what I'm going to do. And he took bread and he broke it and gave it to them like a manna in the wilderness. It was abundant, and it was what they needed in that moment. It was what would sustain them in the hours, the days, and the weeks ahead. This is my body broken for you. This is the blood of the covenant which is poured out for you. Did their selective remembrance include when Moses makes the covenant with the people at Sinai and puts half the sacrificial blood on the altar and half on the people, binding them in covenant? And to that binding, they all said with Moses, yes, yes. Yes, yes, we'll do it. We'll be obedient. And we know how the story unfolds. And this brings us to gift number 4. Let people know where you're headed. We know Jesus is headed to 2 more mountains, the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane, where he will wrestle with his own yes, yes to God, where he will feel the power of life and the challenge of living fully into it and fully in out of the love of God for all creation. There, he will again hear, I believe, the still small voice of God that says, you are my beloved. I will not forsake you. You are my beloved. Go and be so in the world. We know that Jesus is heading to Calvary. Not a high mountain by any standard. Some, if you were in the high peaks of New York, would call Calvary no mountain at all. But it is a place to which we lift our eyes, where we will see Jesus raised up, crucified and died to show us that he would not abandon God's love for the world, that he would not abandon the way of love, that he would not play the religious and political games that in his day and in ours draws people away from their yes to God, a life of love. We know where Jesus is headed. Will we follow? I think we cannot enter the next few weeks with selective memory. We can't walk with Jesus and the disciples to the final mountain, Calvary, with selective memory. We have to remember the whole story. The story of God's consistent, steadfast, possessive love that enfolds us when we're in a mountaintop experience and you go like, yes, Jesus, I get it. I'm here. I feel connected. And in those moments in the valley where you say the opening words of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me. To remember that God is with us in both those places, and that we are challenged by God to live. How are we supposed to live? One-footed. One-footed, always remembering, no matter where you cannot take a step without doing 1 foot at a time. Every single time you take that step is an invitation from God to remember that love and to remember who and whose you are and how you are called to live it, to love God, to love your neighbor with all of who you are, and to love yourself as well. We have to take each step to Calvary 1 foot at a time, 1 moment at a time, remembering that God is relentless. I love that idea of a relentless God, inviting us to say, yes, yes. As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. That God is there in the still, small voice that calls us to love God and only God. God longs to hear your yes with contrite and sincere hearts. So we'll get our bearings. Stand on 1 foot. We'll be ready for the unexpected. Miracles truly, truly happen. We can face our fears of the unknown. We can face the fear of death itself and know that God's love will uphold us when we're on the edge. And we'll let people know where we're headed. We're headed to Calvary. We're headed to the cross. But my friends, we are headed beyond that. We are headed beyond that, 1 sure foot at a time. Thanks.